Okay, well, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche. Tonight we'll be hearing from Paul Gallagher. Before we do, we want to talk a little bit about actions in the Congress, but not really in and of themselves, but as a kind of a theater of war, a theater of intelligence operations, and to say something about our own organization's deployment in this circumstance. Now, what's been going on is, as a result of significant upheaval happening in the physical economy, and then reflections of this in France, Germany, other locations, Greece, notably, the tissue of lives, a fabric of lives, a system of lives that has been characteristic of much of daily discourse in the transatlantic sector or the Anglosphere beginning to unravel. That doesn't mean that people are prepared to take arms against the sea of troubles, which are their respective financial institutions and governments. But it does provide an occasion in which much larger doses of truth are able to be heard, and the options for people to actually respond and to do something based on that truth have increased. Now, sometimes those who've been around and have talked with us over the course of years have heard a discussion about something called the mass strike process. And perhaps tonight, Paul may decide to allude to that and maybe even talk about that a little bit. But I just want to say that there's a very specific process we're involved in right now in the United States. It is the case that, of course, large portions of the American people, perhaps as much as 2/3, have often managed to keep themselves out of any commitment to reversing the long train of abuses that have characterized American political life, particularly since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That is, and it's not unusual, one should point out that even during the American Revolution, only about 1/3 of the people in the nation at that time actually supported that cause. So to say that 2 out of every 3 Americans is either neutral or opposed or is disconnected from what needs to be done to actually change the nation in a positive direction, or to propose policies in the interest of humanity, that's a fairly normal ratio for the nation and for that form of intervention. So where we are tonight is no exception to that. But the one thing that has happened is that the terror that has reigned in American politics has been to some degree challenged, partially by the Nord Stream pipeline revelations of Seymour Hersh, and also by a vote that happened in the Congress of the United States actually just yesterday afternoon, actually sometime around 5:30. And this involved reversing the deployment of American troops in Syria. Now, the resolution did not pass. It was a resolution that was offered by Congressman Gates of Florida, which basically called on President Biden to remove all U.S. armed forces from Syria. And as he put it, that is, in a press release that had come out before the vote, Gates said that, quote, Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. The United States is currently not in a war with or against Syria. So why are we conducting dangerous military operations there? It's important to clarify that he was not speaking about American military operations of a clandestine nature, but he was speaking about uniformed military being there. Now, there were all sorts of things done in the vote. There were 103 congressmen in the House of Representatives. It says 57 Democrats and 46 Republicans who voted in favor of withdrawing troops from Syria. There was a mobilization by the Republican Party against this, so that the final vote was 321 to 103. This is notable because this was, of course, a Republican congressman putting something in, and of course, if one were to believe the presumption of isolationism on the basis of America First and all those things that one purports to represent as as Republican statements of policy, one would have thought that the party's representatives would have wanted to support such a resolution on the part, since it's offered by a Republican, and certainly seemed to make sense, especially given that the United States wishes to go to war with China. It may not be saying that, but it's relatively clear that that's the intention, and is at war with Russia, in effect, through NATO and through the so-called proxy war in Ukraine. So we ought to get out of Syria. But no, that wasn't what happened. Something else occurred. And why this is important, as Gates and others who voted for the resolution would point out, or could point out, is that the Congress of the United States is the entity that is given the power under the Constitution of the United States to prosecute war. And the president has to ask for that. But the president had not. No presidents had asked for that. Or at whatever point that, in the case of the 2011-2012 period, there was actual discussion, and of course there was the vote that prohibited Barack Obama at one point in 2012, I believe that was, from bombing Syria. And so why this is important is that those that voted against the resolution were voting against the Congress, that is, the powers of the Congress, and against utilizing and demanding to utilize the powers of the Congress. So these are people who occupy a position that they themselves have attempted to destroy. And it's a relevant point to make, regardless of what one thinks about their view of sanctions or other policies. Now, it's also worth noting that the Congress had also just taken a vote which overwhelmingly endorsed maintaining the murderous Caesar sanctions against Syria, even as Syria has experienced an earthquake and as various civilians, people who are clearly not part of any political faction, particularly children and elderly and others, find themselves either buried out under rubble, digging out from under rubble, homeless, and without adequate shelter in winter conditions in that country. So one could say, oh, well, this just shows you how immoral the Congress is. But that's not why we did what we did. What we're looking at and what we are attempting to show or demonstrate is that there is an intersection of this story on Syria with the Nord Stream story and with conditions that are presently unraveling in the not the United States, but in the transatlantic sector, financial conditions that have converged. The battlefield condition in Ukraine, without going into a lot of details, is not favorable to Ukraine. It is the case that it's already been stated, in effect by Jens Stoltenberg of NATO, that at the rate at which ammunition is being used by Ukraine, and at the rate of replenishment of that ammunition that can be reached or achieved by the United States or by Europe, that Ukraine will run out of ammunition by the summer. It's important to recognize that the majority of casualties in the battlefield have come from artillery, so that discussions about airplanes or troop movements or these other things haven't really meant much. And what you're dealing with is something that those who are familiar with the actual advantage that the United States brought to the Second World War readily know, that the United States' ability to produce via its assembly lines and its industrial capacity in the Second World War was what was the margin of victory, and it gave the United States the ability to fight a two-front war in ways that no other country possibly could. Now, we've gutted those capabilities. We have deindustrialized the United States. We have demoralized and degraded our workforce, and we've essentially, through the legalization of drugs, destroyed the cognitive capacities of both young and not so young workers. So we don't have the ability to do what we did in the Second World War. Whereas the Russian economy, which is spending about a tenth or less of what we are spending on our military here, is capable of reaching these production capabilities way beyond what the United States or Europe combined is presently committed to doing. And the problem, of course, would be if they try to commit to more, then they would have to reveal to their own populations that Ukraine is losing the war. And further than that, that the commitments that have been made so far, including the monetary commitments, are way too little. And so, the question is, can you do that politically? And the answer is no, you would not be able to do that politically. And so they are in a peculiar circumstance. Now, that is not to say that the battle circumstances are determining what's going on at all. But it is to say that the circumstance we find ourselves in tonight in America is unlike any circumstance that we have seen in this way since probably the time of the Vietnam War. What is meant by that is that Seymour Hersh's exposés, combined with the questions that are being posed by those that are looking at this issue of the proxy war of NATO and the United States against Russia, in which the United States has actually already militarily attacked Russia and Germany by blowing up the pipelines, realize that the line has already been crossed into World War III. That World War III is actually a fact as of now, and that the problem that we are dealing with in the case of the State Department and other entities is a problem of imbecility. See, the last stage of decadence is imbecility. We have a situation in which there is an assumption that people are making that there's some sort of grand strategy that these people think they have, whereas in fact you've got a combination of arrogance and incompetence with the availability of thermonuclear weapons. And therefore, it doesn't mean that they would necessarily consciously use them, but that they are completely capable of creating a circumstance in which some form of usage might occur. And although one may find the stories about the Ukrainian hit team that blew up the pipelines to be ludicrous, one has to also understand that any group of people dumb enough, if you want to put it that way, to put forward a story like that would also be perhaps prepared to put forward a story like that about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. Somehow, some renegade group just got loose, and who knew? There it was. And it was used. So we're in that kind of unfortunate, absurdist geometry. One of the things that Helga has made clear Helga Zeppler-Rusin made clear in recent days, it's important for us to recognize, to identify for people in the country, in the United States and in transatlantic world, that a series of conferences, Helsinki conference, other conferences that have been held in recent years, in months and years, have identified the idea of dismantling Russia. There's this term called decolonizing Russia. What this refers to is the idea of reducing the population of Russia from 140 million people to 50 million people. That's an actual specific proposal and was referred to by Lech Walesa of Poland back about a year and a half ago. So depopulation of Russia is the goal, is the intent. And that can only be done by decomposition of Russia. This is a mad scheme, but it is the scheme. It's important for us to make sure people understand this because this precedes the Ukraine conflict entirely. Thus, the vote yesterday in Congress, while not a victory, nonetheless assembles at least, or rather creates a semblance of sanity in the Congress, which doesn't mean that the congressmen are necessarily any good. It just means that it's possible through the combined efforts of ourselves and others, including, by the way, people from the Republican and Democratic parties who may be able to be reached on certain matters of policy, to stand up for something which allows the United States to continue to, not only survive, but for us to continue a process that we've tried to set into motion around the 10 principles for a new strategic and development architecture. This is not a Pollyannish, let's all hold hands peace proposal. This is something that's being proposed as a strategic intervention into a suicidal, imbecilic set of policies or quasi-policies out of the State Department and out of a sort of a secret government that must be brought under control. So it is not enough, as a lot of people do, to claim that this thing is so powerful, nobody can take it on. We don't know what to do. That is not only inadequate, it's immoral. There is a way to take it on, and it has to be reversed, and it is the responsibility of the American people to do that. And it doesn't matter what the American people think about that. It doesn't matter how much they may want to say individually. It's not their responsibility. It is, and they will be judged accordingly in history as they should be. So if the American people don't decide to step up and do something about this, they are just as criminally liable for every crime being committed, whether it be in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, wherever it may be, as the government that they purport to detest. Now, we are not prepared to be that tragic. And in our interventions and our work, we try to make available to people, the opportunity, including this phone call or these Thursday fireside chats, to really be presented with something that allows us all to think together and to think outside of these confines so that we can then proceed, coming off phone calls like this and other forms of mobilization, to do what needs to be done. I requested that Paul would talk to us tonight, especially because there's various forms of rumblings and perturbations, a kind of precursors to an earthquake, a financial earthquake that's sitting there, and may not be as spectacular as something like what happened in Turkey, but nonetheless has to be understood, especially 1 year into the failed sanctions policy against Russia and the impending expansion of sanctions policies against China. And so the idea is to try to see if we can, again, get at the underlying causes for a lot of what we're seeing on the surface. There's something else going on underneath. And as Lyndon LaRouche always insisted, you got to look at the physical economy first in order to be able to evaluate what's going on in the superstructure of politics. And so Paul's with us tonight, and he's going to now take over and give us a look at things, and then from there we'll have questions and discussion. So, Paul?
Okay. Thanks. Just to note, under the surface is perhaps becoming a little more above the surface. There are several banks in the United States that seem to be in the process of going under just in these days, and they're not. One of them is a small bank. It's called Silvergate Bank in San Diego, which has liquidated today, or made the decision yesterday, I guess, to liquidate, casualty of taking cryptocurrency deposits on a large scale. That's a small bank. A much larger one in California called Silicon Valley Bank looks to be in similar kind of trouble, although not in this case not cryptocurrency deposits, but venture capital being deposited by startups and then being withdrawn because investment in them has stopped, being withdrawn very rapidly, burning their cash. That bank is in trouble. That's a large bank. It's not large by Wall Street standards. It's a regional bank. There is another one on Wall Street, another smaller bank, also in trouble for cryptocurrency reasons. So this is lurking there all the time, and it's coming closer. But what I want to discuss is what the Federal Reserve is doing and why, what it's really doing and why. Because in recent days we've again seen this ritual that they go to on Wall Street markets where Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, makes a speech, talks about interest rates going up. There are big drops in the stock market for a couple of days, and people are given the impression that there is some relationship between what Powell is talking about and inflation. They're given the impression that the Federal Reserve is doing these interest rate increases in order to control inflation. I'm going to try to make clear that that's fundamentally wrong. I want to start with this question, which I received today from Phil Ulanowski, a longtime colleague, LaRouche colleague. It's several paragraphs that he sent to me in the form of a comment, really, but I'll just read the last one. When Wall Street reacts with a market fall, he names, I think, 600 points from yesterday. When Wall Street reacts with a market fall, it suggests to me that the falling out among thieves is getting sharper. The oligarchy's identity is to survive everything. I think the ongoing decisions on rates and so on in a financially insoluble crisis bear resemblance to the Nord Stream sabotage. That is, to hell with former alliances, it's survival of the fittest. The Fed is following orders from higher up. That was his comment. It is absolutely right to make the analogy that the Federal Reserve is carrying out, quote, Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, unquote, in another form. Liquefied natural gas exported by the United States and in second place by Norway, same two that Seymour Hersh identified in the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. Their LNG has taken the place of the Russian natural gas, which is vital to European industry, and are looting that industry with much higher prices for the energy. United States subsidies are preventing European companies' electric vehicles from being sold in the United States. The Biden administration has taken key Chinese markets away from the most advanced chip semiconductor manufacturing equipment manufacturers in Europe and Japan and hurt other chip manufacturers' sales. European governments, with the financial aid supposedly to Ukraine, are paying significant shares, right along with U.S. taxpayers, of the cost of the armaments going to Ukraine, of which the biggest U.S. arms manufacturers and the military consulting companies are getting the great majority of the work. It's similar to the way the Saudis were made to pay a significant chunk of the cost to the United States for the Iraq wars. The French military budget in 2022 rose by 40% from the previous year. That 40% jump represents a larger increase than the amount at issue in the cuts that Macron is trying to make in the pensions by raising the retirement age, by the so-called pension fund reform. So the whatever it was, 1.5 million, 2 million French people in the streets yesterday and again tomorrow, Saturday, are fighting a war economy in that sense. German military spending was doubled over 2 years by a special fund of 100 billion euros, and then the current defense minister of Germany says that this 100 billion was not enough. The German defense budget up until that special fund was 50 billion a year, so that gives you an idea of the scope of the increase. Greece, $4.5 billion has been thrown by the Greek government into arming Ukraine, and that is in the context of a complete starvation for years now of investment in infrastructure, vital infrastructure in the Greek economy. And the results, the kind of disasters as the crash which has killed, I think, close to 60 people, perhaps more than that, many of those students, young people, of the two trains, and for which tens and tens of thousands of Greeks are and have been out in the streets in recent days. So add to that the rising transatlantic interest rates are devaluing the currencies of the developing nations, and they're pushing capital flight out of them, and that capital flight is going to the United States, not to Europe, but to the United States, because of the actions of the Federal Reserve, which actions are aggressively pushing up the yield on investments in the United States, on everything from short-term Treasury securities to bank securities to corporate bonds, etc. So the question raised here is, what is the Federal Reserve doing in raising these rates, and why? Or what is it doing more broadly? I raised the question in another way for this discussion. If inflation is raging in the major European economies at rates at least several percent worse than in the U.S. economy, then why is the Federal Reserve raising its federal funds rate this month to 5%, perhaps even a little higher, while the European Central Bank is only preparing to raise them to 3%? You would think the opposite would be true. Or to take another example, in December, when the Bank of England confronted a situation where all of a sudden the pension funds, the largest pension funds in the UK, were about to go under. They were going to liquidate. They told the bank that they would because of the combination of the brief Liz Truss government trying to simultaneously drastically increase military spending and at the same time make a big reduction in taxes. That drove her out of office, brought the Bank of England into the driver's seat, where what they did was to resume money printing. They resumed quantitative easing. Temporarily, they were in the middle of supposedly cutting back quantitative tightening, but then they suddenly resumed quantitative easing and printed money to buy bonds from these pension funds at whatever value the pension funds wanted to give them in order to bail out the speculative activity of those same pension funds, the derivatives investments of those same pension funds. Once that was done and the pound sterling, which had been briefly collapsing, went back up, and note, by money printing, the Bank of England got the pound, the value of the pound, not to decline, but to go back up. Once they had done that, they stopped. But they called on, in the process, the Bank of England called on the regulators, they called them, the central banks all over the transatlantic and in the Japan and so forth at the same time, to be prepared to step in these shadow banking problems, as they called them, and make sure that these shadow banks were resilient and that they're in other words, they said, we have to keep these highly speculative derivatives and other investments going on. We have to keep them liquid. If that means we have to shift from tightening the money supply to suddenly increasing it, then we do that because that's what central banks are supposed to do, they think, and that's what the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England definitely do. So no evidence has been presented by economists that the raising of interest rates, even the rapid raising recently by interest rates by the several central banks, has had any effect up to now on the rates of inflation in those countries. The behavior of investors in the stock markets, by the way, indicate that they do not expect that they will have such an effect. Most economists acknowledge, in fact, that it is too soon to see effects of the rate increases on inflation. There haven't been any. The inflation tempered briefly for other reasons. There are effects on the stock markets. Those are constantly discussed. This should not be confused with an effect on inflation. Now, we should consider that the Federal Reserve's aggressive rate increases are for other reasons entirely. Those other reasons include financial warfare against China's currency, the yuan or the renminbi, which is clearly the currency which is challenging the dollar for the potential of a new international development architecture with a new reserve currency. The other reasons, not controlling inflation, those other reasons for raising rates include economic warfare by the United States within the so-called global NATO. Those reasons are part of a policy of financial and economic warfare by the United States against its own so-called NATO allies within its sanctions war and its NATO war against Russia. The objective, you might say, is not a 2% or lower rate of U.S. consumer price inflation, which is what they talk about, but a 2% or greater rate, 2% of GDP or higher rate of military spending by the European nations. Now, so go back to the start of this current episode of inflation and commodity hyperinflation. In the middle of September 2019, big U.S.-based banks suddenly stopped lending to big European banks and stopped lending to shadow banks like hedge funds at all. There have been large losses in credit markets, which only surfaced later. One example is shown in the death agony since then of the Credit Suisse Bank. But at the same time, what was obvious is that the key interest rates in the United States and European banking systems had been zero or negative for years, and yet lending among banks and shadow banks froze. It halted. So obviously, super low interest rates of central banks, they may make speculating and gambling loans easy to pay for. They don't necessarily make them easy to get. By the same token, normal or higher central bank interest rates make speculative lending harder to pay for. They don't necessarily make it harder to get. And in the recent period, quite the opposite. The Federal Reserve stepped in that situation on September 16, 2019, began making liquidity loans to big banks, which ran up over $100 billion every day for several weeks. And then the Federal Reserve restarted qualitative easing, money printing, early that October, and that, through the start of the COVID pandemic 5 months later, became the most gigantic wave of money printing ever seen, ever dreamed of, lasting through mid-2022, totaling $9 trillion in money printing in 2 years by the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve alone. The Federal Reserve led this. It also pushed the U.S. Treasury into a partnership in which it borrowed and spent, the Treasury that is, borrowed and spent $5 trillion more in so-called emergency COVID spending over that time. That definitely triggered raging commodity inflation, raging speculation, then raging consumer and producer product inflation, and very importantly, it drove down productivity growth all over the transatlantic economies to historic low levels. The decline in productivity by its various measures between 2019 and the current time, early 2023, has been historic and essentially has eliminated productivity growth of any kind in the U.S. economy or in the major European economies. And it also made sure that that money printing made sure that the economic stagnation of the decade after the 2008 crash would become a deepening economic recession across the transatlantic countries, which we're now in. So broadly, when the money printing slowed to a stop by mid-2022, the inflation slowed somewhat. When the printing of money slowed to a stop, not when interest rates were increased by any particular amount or at any particular speed, but rather when the money printing slowed down, inflation slowed somewhat. But remember that the economic war in which the Federal Reserve is playing a leading part included necessarily building up a gigantic new bubble in green finance and renewable energy including the war to destroy the world's leading fossil fuel producer, Russia. Lyndon LaRouche forecast this as long ago as 2011 quite precisely. The war against Russia the British would want, the U.S. would participate in, which if it was won, would allow them to write off their debts, any debts they wish to, Wall Street and London, and build the new bubbles that they wanted to build. So when the money printing tapered and stopped to try to slow inflation, perversely inflation hit all the big producers of renewable energy, particularly the wind producers, and now most of the big offshore wind farm products are in projects are in financial trouble. They're being slowed, they're being paused, etc. Same thing is happening to electric vehicle producers and so on. But inflation is continuing to burn, to flare up, to gather strength again in many sectors, and will gather strength in the economies as a whole. The rising interest rates will have essentially nothing to do with that. In fact, they will tend to be promoting it. The Biden administration is simply seeking domination of markets at the expense of its own allies in semiconductor chips, in natural gas, in oil, in electric vehicles, and so on. At the same time, those very sectors are sinking into recession and into deeper recession. And the Biden administration is trying to save the dollar's international reserve role and stop China's economic growth and strength in every way, including by attacking its currency with high U.S. Interest rates. So this is a war within the war, an economic war within the economic war on Russia and now on China in the area of semiconductor chips, in particular on China. It's an economic war within that war, and it is the source of tremendous hardship hitting populations in particular, selectively in Europe, in the larger economies in Europe in particular, driving them into the streets in a situation which has mass strike characteristics, so that it is causing a situation along the lines of what Dennis, an organizable situation along the lines of what Dennis was indicating at the beginning. I think, remains to be said that this issue of productivity is actually not only the key, it's essentially the only issue really involved with inflation. The only way in which inflation can be reduced, and not immediately, but over a period of time, is by large-scale investments in particularly infrastructure using the most advanced and energy-dense new technologies, and implanting those new technologies in basic infrastructure. That raises technological productivity and labor productivity more than anything else. And that process, what LaRouche identified long ago as the counter to the decay of capital under non-investment, this kind of productivity, rapid productivity growth through human invention and the application of new technologies to basic infrastructure in particular, that over a period of time lowers the cost in intellectual and physical labor of the production of everything, and thereby brings the prices down over a period of time, can actually bring inflation under control. By contrast, what the Federal Reserve has been trying to do in the recent period, in concert with the Wall Street and the Biden administration, is similar to what Gallagher, the head of the Central Bank of Germany, did in the 1930s, where he was able to effectively seize control of the federal government spending, the fiscal activity of the Nazi government, support it with money printing, the infamous Meffel bill system, and drive that spending into military spending to a very rapid degree, from 2% of GDP to 20% of German GDP in a matter of 2 years, becoming military spending. And then, in 1937, early 1938, Jacques realized that rapid inflation was being set off by what the central bank, above all, was doing. And he then tried to convince Hitler that he should pause on the war mobilization and instead conduct a trade war with the United States, that he should concentrate on exports and especially conducting a trade war throughout the Americas with the United States. Well, of course, Hitler did not listen to him but fired him. But that is exactly the kind of situation and the kind of reaction you're seeing in the Federal Reserve and the other central banks, to the extent that they can do it. But the Federal Reserve is exerting its financial superiority over those banks and forcing them to keep their interest rates lower and to keep printing money. The ECB is still doing that, to keep printing new money in order to support the speculation, the volume of speculation in the banking systems of the European countries, whereas the Federal Reserve has other objectives in view. So I'll just say that much. That's what I think it's doing, and that's why I think it's doing it. It's very different from what we're told every day is actually going on, and the so-called fight against inflation by raising interest rates. So let me end with that, at least unless there are further questions and discussion.
Okay, I'll open up the queue, press *6 to get in the queue, and I think I'll get some questions started myself here. I think, Paul, what I'd like you to do is take up the last point you were making, particularly with respect to Hjalmar Schacht and what fascism actually is in terms of the actual economic policies, as opposed to all of the mythical things that people think it involves. Sure, there are political manifestations, but it's a very specific process. And you mentioned the fight between Hjalmar Schacht and Hitler in 1937, and said that Schacht was proposing a trade war with the United States as opposed to what Hitler wished to do. And I wish if you would say a bit about what that was, since, of course, we're talking about the military expansionism that also happened. The reason I'm asking that question is when you're looking at Ukraine, are we looking at a process which is in any way similar to the one that Hitler wished to do, and is that process intended to do the same kind of looting that was seen? And one of the particular reasons I'm asking is because in the agricultural sector, we just reported, I think last week, Marcia and Bob Baker were reporting the level of land seizures that have happened as a result of speculators from outside of Ukraine taking over all kinds of land there. So that's the first question I'd like to ask. There are some people in the queue. Again, press *6 to get in the queue.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Keep it quick. First on Schacht, he did what really is involved in a fascist takeover. That is, he was able to combine the central bank itself and the largest German banks, two of the largest German banks, together with the biggest industrial and arms producers like ThyssenKrupp and others, into a combine which began to print money, in effect. The Meffel bills were an issuance of that combination of central bank, major banks, and major military industrial companies. They effectively became a state, since Schacht was at the same time the economics minister and the head of the Reichsbank of the Nazi government. And they drove the investment in the economy into war production, armaments, and especially ammunition production, and drove it through several phases in which other areas of the economy were cannibalized in order to support and build up more. And as I said, from 2% of GDP in 2 years, 33 to 35, it became 20% of economic activity in the German economy was military activity or arms production. And then proposed instead, because of the inflation this set off, although he fully agreed with Hitler in terms of seizing back, as he put it, seizing back eastern territories, which by rights he said should belong to Germany, he was in the same political current. He was no ivory tower banker there. He was in the same political current as Hitler. He had helped to get Hitler and the Nazis into power in the first place. And he proposed that they draw back from the next set of invasions and occupations that Hitler had in mind, and instead go after the United States in South America in a trade war. Schacht thought he was in a position to run that because of his complete control by that time of the foreign exchange, of Germany's holdings of foreign exchange, and the ability of exporting companies to get hold of that foreign exchange in order to do what they had to do in a trade war. It's a complicated thing. I won't try to describe it. But the idea was, and they made some headway in this, to seize South American markets in trade from the United States, which was then under the Roosevelt administration and the good neighbor policy. That's one side of it. In terms of Ukraine, that's certainly could be a going idea because of the possibility and the obvious desire of the Zelensky government now to be part of an agricultural products trade war with Russia. I think people can see that. It's right on the surface. And the aspects of the Ukrainian economy, agricultural economy involved, are controlled by the largest agro-business multinationals, and they own they actually have not gotten to ownership of a great deal of the land, but to the same kind of control of the marketing of the product, the agricultural products of Ukraine, that they have in the United States, and in fact even a somewhat greater control. So all of these things, which I think people can see around the so-called Black Sea Grain Agreement and so forth, and the things that the Zelensky government says about it as a kind of ventriloquist dummy for some of the forces involved here, it wants an agricultural products trade war with Russia.